Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Star Trek Rewatch. We're pretty much every Thursday, with an exception here or there, I watch an episode of Star Trek the original series and then review it, talk about the episode in summary, and then give some of my thoughts on it. So this week's episode is a great one. This is episode number 14, Balance of Terror. Now this was number 9 in production order. So you'll see, for instance, like Grace Lee Whitney's character Yeoman Rand appears in this episode, but we've already seen her last episode appearance, which was last week when we watched Conscience of the King. So this was filmed prior to that episode, and it gets confusing whether you're watching these in production order or if you're watching them in the original air date. Here, we've chosen to go in the original air date, so that's something to keep in mind. Now, this episode originally aired on December 15th of 1966, and as always, looking at Alan Asherman's compendium for this show, go into some of the production history on this real quick. So the first draft, or the final draft script for this, was put out on July 14th of 1966, and this was filmed in early August of 1966. The writer for this was Paul Schneider. The director for this episode was Vincent McEverty. The composer was Fred Steiner, and the photographic effects were done by Film Effects of Hollywood. Now we'll get into the summary, and then I'll talk about this. So here we go. The Enterprise is patrolling the Earth outpost along the Romulan neutral zone. So this is the first appearance of the Romulans, which will be a enemy. You know, have we seen the Klingons yet? I don't think we've seen the Klingons yet. So the main enemies or antagonists in the original series will be the Romulans and the Klingons. So here's our first appearance of the Romulans, and they will be a staple of Star Trek going well throughout the canon, of all iterations of the show. So they are patrolling along the Romulan neutral zone, which cuts off planets Romulus and Remus from Federation space. The Romulans, a warlike race, had fought a war with the Federation a century before. As Captain Kirk is about to perform a wedding ceremony of crew members Angela Martine and Robert Tomlinson, an Earth outpost announces that it's under attack. So Spock calls down in the midst of the ceremony with a red alert, and everything gets put on hold. Now, this is kind of foreshadowing, right? Like, I wouldn't exactly call it Chekhov's gun principle. Chekhov's wedding here, all right? Like, this is going to come back later in the episode. This Angela Martine and Robert Tomlinson. So they're under attack, and the Starship Enterprise, they witness the destruction of the outpost, but they're helpless to assist. They can't get there in time. So they see on screen, they communicate with the outpost. Captain Kirk gets to the bridge. They identify the attacking vessel, but the outpost can't do anything. It's basically on fire, and the dude's like calling for assistance, but they can't help him. Kirk learns that the Romulans have perfected an invention that renders their spaceships invisible. So here we have the first appearance of the cloaking device. So right now in this episode, we have the Romulans possess this technology, and later on the Klingons will as well. We'll get to that in season 3. It's interesting, for most of the original series, like the Klingons do not have cloaking devices. Only the Romulans do. But we'll talk about that later when we get to, I believe the episode in season 3 is called The Enterprise Incident. So we got a long way before we get there. All right, so the cloaking device. It says they're testing out their new device. Kirk reasons that he must overtake and destroy the enemy vessel before it can return home. So we have a really nice, conference room thing where we have a lot of the senior staff get together. So you've got McCoy, Kirk, I think Sulu is there, and then there's this guy named Styles who's in navigation. He's the navigator in this episode, sitting alongside of Sulu, who's always the helmsman. And he's evidently, there's a lot of tension between him and Spock and Kirk for a lot of this episode, because Styles, I guess his ancestors fought in the Earth and Romulan War, and we learn here that no Earthling has ever seen a Romulan because they didn't have like ship to ship viewing technology back then when this war was fought. And Spock notifies us that it was fought with primitive atomic weapons. So the peace treaty, the Treaty of Algernon that ended the Romulan Earth War, was done through subspace transmission. So nobody actually ever saw anybody face to face. And so they've established this neutral zone between Federation and Romulan space. Later on, it will be called the Romulan Star Empire. I think once you get to like Star Trek The Next Generation, a lot of this stuff gets fully more developed, these alien races, but this is the first appearance here. Spock surmises that the Romulans may be an offshoot of the Vulcans. Of course, this will later be confirmed in Star Trek The Next Generation. For certain it is, because there's actually a episode, I think it's called Unification. Unification Part 1 and Part 2, where Ambassador Spock will go to Romulus to try to help reunify the two separated races. You know, he's basically going undercover there to help the Romulan, I guess, underground Romulans learn the teachings of Vulcan, the teachings of Surak. But that's way later on. So this stuff is all foundational, and it gets further fleshed out in this continuity of the series. So Styles here. So Styles okay, let's see. Where am I at? Kirk reasons that he must overtake and destroy the enemy vessel before he can return home. On the advice of Spock. Spock says, you got to do it, because if they are indeed like us, you know, they're like Vulcans that haven't tamed their passengers, then they have to be stopped. So they got to get them before they return back across the neutral zone. The Romulans, the Romulans are found to appear almost exactly like the Vulcans. There's a big reveal, right, where they are able to spy on the bridge, and lo and behold, they see a bunch of Romulans on the bridge, and one of them turns around. Of course, it's Mark Leonard, who is playing the commander of the Romulan vessel here, who would later go on to play Spock's father in a later episode. In fact, we're going to see Mark Leonard again in Journey to Babel, where he's going to play Spock's dad. All right? Now, let's see here. We'll go on. Styles expresses prejudice and distrust of Mr. Spock. He thinks Spock is a Romulan spy. And Kirk's not having none of that at all. So we get to see a little bit of, I guess you would call it, xenophobic behavior here, right? When the Romulan commander is fully cornered, he self-destructs his ship rather than surrender. Styles, whose life has been saved by Spock, realizes that his prejudiced attitude is wrong. Crew member Tomlinson is killed. All right, so Tomlinson dies. So the wedding, the guy that was going to get married, is the only casualty in this episode. Now, I kind of feel bad because last week I said we haven't seen anybody die in like 5 weeks. And I said, I really hope somebody dies next week. Well, now I feel bad about it because the dude that was getting married is the only casualty. Brings our crewman death count for the entirety of the series up to 20. But I don't feel really happy about it. But his Angela Martine, crew member Angela Martine, we will see her again next week in our next episode. She'll be back. Okay, and I think that'll be her final appearance. But unfortunately, Tomlinson, he didn't make it. The pretty dramatic scene where they need to return phaser fire on the Romulan vessel, and the phaser control is flooded with gas. The coolant, there's a coolant leak. Pretty cool effect. But Spock runs back in there and drags these guys out. And unfortunately, Dr. McCoy is not able to save Tomlinson. But he saves Styles. And Styles realizes the error of his way and misjudging Mr. Spock. You know, he's basically like, Mr. Spock saved my life. The end of the episode is going to end with Captain Kirk going to the wedding chapel where he was going to marry these two, this Angela Martine and Robert Tomlinson, and he says, like, it never makes sense. And she basically tells him she's going to be okay. And then it ends with Kirk walking down the corridors. There is a really great scene in this episode between Kirk and McCoy, where Dr. McCoy is kind of listening to Kirk talk about the burden of command, and then McCoy gives him some consolation where he says, he talks about life throughout the galaxy and the possibilities of it on all these planets and the numbers of people all over the place and the unique identities of each and every one of us. And he tells his friend Kirk here, he says, don't destroy the one named Jim. I thought it was a really touching moment between these two characters, and it really shows like they're not just crewmates with each other, they're friends. And it's great, man. Between this relationship between Kirk, Spock, and McCoy continues to be the heart of this series, and it really gives this series some gravitas, something that you can really sink your teeth into. And I really do believe that that's why the original series has endured as long as it has. Despite the fact that technology and special effects have gotten so much better, the bedrock of Star Trek, if it wasn't for this relationship between Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, brought to life by William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and DeForest Kelley, I don't know that Star Trek would still be talked about today. It would have been just another run-of-the-mill science fiction show. And this is a great episode. In fact, I'm going to say I think this is my favorite episode of the series so far. It's definitely in that top tier level. This is an all-time great. Now, I will say one thing about this episode that's kind of wonky, and it is every time they say fire phasers, it shows the photon torpedo effect. So they're actually firing photons. I'm going to cut them some slack here because this is still early in the production order. And clearly it's a photon and not a phaser, but other than that, this is like that one little thing that they've messed up continuity-wise. I don't think it deteriorates from the overall quality of this one. It's like a submarine battle in space. This really reminds you of like those old World War II, like sub movies. You know what I mean? It's like a naval battle type thing. And it's really quite cool to see Kirk and this Romulan commander pitting wits against each other and anticipating one another's moves. I think this is why Star Trek II, the motion picture Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan is so great, is because it's basically like a ship-to-ship battle. And this episode's got it. This is really fantastic storytelling here. I think the acting is great. I think that the plotting is great. I think that the characters are written really well. For me, if I was rating this on a star scale, this is a 5-star episode for me. And I don't give ratings, but this is a thumbs up, top of the class, all-time great. If I do like a top 10 episodes of Star Trek, the original series, when I complete this whole thing, I would be surprised if Balance of Terror doesn't end up in that list, because I think this is probably like a top 5-er. It may be a top 10 episode all time across all Star Trek. It's that good. This is one that if you have somebody that's never seen Star Trek before, this is one that you could show somebody that just to say, oh, you've never watched Star Trek? Watch this episode. I think this is a great one to show a non-Star Trek fan. So that's why it's like in that top tier level of Star Trek. I guess it's going to wrap it up. I don't have a whole lot else to say. I'm always curious to see what you think about this one, how you are enjoying the watch of Star Trek, if this is your first time watching this series, if this is a rewatch for you. What do you think about the quality of the show, and how does it stand up in comparison to, say, television shows today? Are you finding it too slow? The pacing, the plotting, it is a more cerebral show, and the episodes are longer in length because they didn't have as many commercial interruptions back then. So I'm wondering about the attention span of the audience, if they're able to sink their teeth into this if they're a younger viewer, or if they're an older viewer revisiting this maybe for the first time in a long time, how they feel about it. I know there's a couple here that have watched that have expressed that they're really enjoying rewatching these, and that's exactly how I feel. I haven't watched this series in probably 5 or 6 years, so I'm really enjoying it. There's a lot about these that I'm not remembering. I'm like, oh, I didn't remember them going through the tail of a comet. I didn't remember that happening, so I was really like, oh, this is cool. Really great stuff. All right, thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day.